5, 4, 3. All right. I believe we are live. Hello, hello. This is Justin Coletti from Sonic Scoop. Let me know if you can see me and hear me in the live chat down there. Super privileged to have on today the great Joe Chiccarelli. Joe, joining us from California. How are you doing today?
Good, good. Thanks for having me. We've been trying to get this together for quite some time now. I'm glad it's finally working out. I'm here.
Yeah, super excited. You've been near the top of our list to have on mixcon for years, and so excited to have been able to see your process and get just a peek under the hood of the way you work. Man, there's so many cool things in here. I just have a ton of questions about, how you approach things, how you listen, and how you do your thing. And so do so many of the people who've joined us. So grateful that we'll be able to ask you these questions. You guys type into the chat box. Let us know, first of all, your name, where you're joining us from. And if you have any questions, put them right there into the live chat. We just finished a mixcon masterclass with Joe. It was totally great. You got to check it out in the channel. If you haven't already, look in the description, and there's a link to the main masterclass there. A couple of quick notes before we get into asking Joe all of your questions. One, the band Cayucas. Thank you guys so much for letting us dive under the hood of this track. We have links to their music as well. Really fun track called Ride the Wave. So definitely check them out. Also, big thanks to IK Multimedia. They make a whole bunch of great plugins, notably their whole T-Rax line. I think Joe on here uses their Space Echo extensively in the Sunset Sound, I believe, chambers. So he's using some of their effects on there. But most notably, he uses probably the coolest IK Multimedia plugin ever made, which is the Joe Chiccarelli vocal strip. How long was that in development, Joe? When did you guys start working on that one?
It's quite a while, maybe like a year or so. I got involved with IK because they came over to Sunset Sound here where my studio is based, and they modeled the rooms and the echo chambers and the live chambers. And they did such a great job with the modeling. I was really blown away. I think they captured the sound of some of the studios at Sunset. So I've had this idea to do a plugin that really is how I mix vocals. If I'm in the analog world or the digital world, I always have lots of parallels. And I don't know, one day I was doing a mix session. It might have even been the cayucas session or something. And I looked and I had about a dozen different parallel compressors and delays and reverbs and all kinds of processing enhancers, exciters on the vocal. And I just looked and I had all these extra tracks, and I was like, there's got to be a compact way to do this. There's got to be one plugin that could be your go-to plugin for vocals that has multiple compressors and effects and EQs, etc. So that's what prompted me to put this whole thing together.
Very cool. And just for people who aren't familiar with the plugin, can you give us a rundown of what's in it and why you think parallel processing is such an important feature to be using in vocals?
Well, to me, parallel processing in general is great because it can be a lot more invisible and at the same time more powerful. I feel like it's a way to get gain and presence without squishing the dynamics of the original signal, whether it's a drum kit or an acoustic guitar or a vocal. So it kind of leaves the natural, depending on how your balances are, it leaves the natural signal intact. So it's something I got turned on to really, really early in my career, where Shelley Yakus, who's a real noted engineer to John Lennon and Alice Cooper and so many different things. Shelley would always use it on vocals. He'd always have an LA2A that he bust out to. And when I started to sit down and play with faders and saw how you could kind of bring it in underneath the lead vocal and get all this chest and fullness and warmth, instantly I started thinking like, oh, maybe you could do that on drums, and oh, maybe you can do that on bass. And it just has a way of filling things out. So basically the plugin is my mixing approach to vocals, which is really multiple compressors, because as you know, every piece of gear has its own character, has its own tone. So I usually use 2 or 3 different compressors. Sometimes I'm using them all at once. Sometimes I'm using them for different sections of the song. If I want a more aggressive vocal sound for the chorus, I pop in one compressor. If I want something nice and full for the body of the song, I have a certain compressor that does that. So I'm kind of blending all the time as I go along. And it's truly, really my approach, whether I was sitting at a analog console 20 years ago, or if I'm all in the box now with plugins.
Mm. Yeah. And another question here about your approach to the parallel stuff. I know this is called the Joe Chiccarelli vocal strip, but would you use this on other instruments as well, or do you take other approaches to parallel compression if you were on something like drums?
No, the funny thing is that I've gotten so many friends call me and say, "Hey, have you tried your own plugin on drums or guitars?"
Yeah.
And, and it seems to work really great. A couple of people told me they loved it on congas and a number of different things. So it's a similar approach to what I might do with drums or any other instrument, but the choices of compressors, the choices of EQ are my sort of go-to things when I'm processing a vocal. And certainly every vocal is different, and the approach doesn't always work, and certainly doesn't work the same for every vocal. But I think at least in one plugin, this can get you to a starting point where you instantly have a vocal sound that really feels like a record, and you can build your mix around that.
Right. Now, more conceptually, just for a second, this is the last thing I'll ask about this plugin before we dive into some of the other questions about your general approach to mixing, and then maybe we'll ask more questions about this plugin if they come in. But I want to ask about the 3 different compressors that are there. If you can just give us a sense from a high level, what are the 3 different compressors, and what are you looking for out of each of them? And are you likely to use more than one of them? Are there certain pairings that you use? Or are you looking more often for the one that's going to give you the most? So give us a sense for why choose those specific 3. What do they do differently? And how do you think about combining them or selecting between them?
Yeah, the first compressor, the main compressor, is really an 1176 model. It's been sort of a go-to thing for a long time. And the thing I like about it is that in parallel, I can hit it pretty hard. And it gives me a nice sense of bigness and fullness to the vocal. And I usually set the attack pretty slow and the release pretty fast. So it's kind of acting natural, but it's got a lot of compression, and I'll blend that in. The second one is more a Fairchild compressor. So it's got a little bit of color and distortion. And I usually have the release time slow. So, whoops, I think we might have lost each other there for a second.
No, we're there. I'm just bringing the plugin up on the screen as you're
go.
talking about, so people
Okay.
can see it a little better.
Okay, great. The second one is the retro, as it's labeled, and it's more Fairchild. And I do set the release on it slower, so it tends to build up the weight of the vocal and give me a bit more breadth and size to the vocal. And then the third one, it's an interesting one, because often I would use a UA tube 176, which is kind of like the tube version of 1176. But initially, we didn't really have a model that we were happy with. So we kind of plugged in an LA2A, we tried a CL1B, and there were some things about both of those that I liked. And then when we finally got the opportunity to model a few 176s, I almost missed some of the things that I had from the LA2A and CL1B. So the guys at IK were pretty brilliant. The whole design team in Italy said, well, why don't we morph together the best things about an optical compressor that we love and the things about this old 176 that we love. And they put together this like hybrid compressor that's pretty great, and it has a lot of character, a lot of grit, a lot of distortion, a lot of personality. So especially for singers that need a little bit more life, a little bit more excitement, or perhaps a rock singer, or
Mhm.
perhaps you're just trying to get a vocal to cut through the track more, that third compressor really has a lot of bite and a lot of zing to it, and really helps it come alive in the track, especially
Ve-
over heavy guitars or something like that.
Very cool. Very cool to hear about the care and detail that went into kind of studying this and like mashing different
No, I mean these guys were great, really brilliant and great at this. I loved what they came up with. They were, and that's the brilliance of putting plugins together. You can really come up with something that's never been made before. You know, for years, plugins have really just simply been emulations of existing analog gear, but now you can get the best and or the worst. You know, you can model all the distortion that you loved in a piece of gear, and because that's what gives it the character. So this was really a fun job in terms of like coming up with things that did the job, but also really delivered a sound and a personality, and you know, had a lot of character, because ultimately that's really what you want in a mix, or just simply recording. You want personality. You want things that jump out of the speakers and really have an impact on people. So sometimes it's really not about designing the perfect piece of gear or software. It's really, in my mind, just having something that's got a color.
All right. Yeah, great. And I really love this idea of doing digital mashups of processors. You know, we've been doing digital
Exactly.
mashups of music for so long that now we're doing mashups of processor. I love it. All right, let's get into some of the questions that came in through the live Q&A. I was going to ask some of my own, but we just have so many questions coming from the audience, so I just want to get straight into them.
All right,
In
hit me
case any
up.
of those questions are, hey, Justin, what's wrong with your lip? I was in a jujitsu competition this weekend, so I have like a cut on my eye and a
No.
busted lip. So, but I got the gold medal, so that's me bragging on the live stream. So hopefully
Impressive.
you won't think that I just left food on my face or something today. All right, let's get right into questions from the audience. And starting with the first one to come in here with Kevin Batchelor, who asked when the drums were being played on this song. He said the snare without the samples added to it sounds almost like it's in reverse. What's happening there? I don't know if you remember everything about this specific session, Joe, but does that bring anything to mind?
You know, this is very interesting. Speaking of parallel processing, over the last few years, I've been doing a thing with drums where, as you saw in the session, there's some tracks of very lo-fi mics. There's a track of a microphone that sits down on the floor by the kick drum, and that's all distorted and blown up. But I've also been doing a thing where I overdrive a preamp, and I actually blend that distortion in with the snare drum track. So you're probably hearing it kind of come up a little bit after the initial attack of the snare. So it almost does sound backwards, or it sounds like the underside of the snares themselves kind of coming up in volume as the decay of the snare drum comes up. So yeah, so it's me actually overdriving a Sonic Farm preamp that I actually helped the guys up at Sonic Farm design.
Oh, very cool. All right. Some more questions came in while you were working on the drums, which I thought was one of the really interesting things here to get a look at. Ashwin Prasanna asks, oh, hi, Ashwin. I think he's a mastering client of mine. Good to have you here on the stream. He asks, wonder how he adds the samples in. It looks like the tracks are consolidated some. Are they manually added and then consolidated? So he's basically asking how you layer in the samples. And he noticed they seem to be in there as one strip. So are you laying them in, then consolidating them, and are using maybe some type of trigger to get them in there? Or are you placing them manually?
I actually use the slate trigger too, and I'll load up what I feel the song needs. A lot of times I like to get samples if I'm using an organic drum kit, a real player in the studio, I like to get samples added to the sounds that give them a little bit more surreal, programmed kind of quality. So some of the samples that are added in might be, 808, 909 kick drums, or maybe a Simmons pad snare drum or something. And I'll load up maybe 6 or 8 kick drum sounds and 6 or 8 snare drum sounds into trigger 2. And then I'll just play with them. I'll just play with the balances and the pitches of them, and find a combination that I like, and do the same thing with the snare. So that one track of printed sample actually might be a blend of 6 samples together, all detuned, or maybe one is at normal pitch and 1 or 2 are detuned but blended very low, and they're going to add a little bit more length to the sample. The other thing too that I'll do is I'll mix those down, and sometimes I mix them through a compressor plug-in or an EQ plug-in. If I feel like the snare is needing more weight, I might mix in a lower tuned snare drum and then add some 150 cycles to it or whatever to give it a little bit more weight with a API EQ plug-in. So that track that you see as snare sample or kick sample really is an amalgamation of anywhere from 2 to 6 samples with some processing on it.
All right, understood. Now, some more questions came in early on about the drums that I also want to ask you about. Sarah Galvin was noticing, wow, the drums sound like they have a lot of compression on them. She typed in the chat, and I kind of said, well, yeah, you can. Well, first of all, it's part of the sound of modern records is compression, but also you can get away with a lot when there's not really any cymbals like there are on this track. And that prompted a whole bunch of people to notice, wow, yeah, what's going on with cymbals? Were they? Let me see if I can read one of the specific questions. One of the folks at Gold Stars was asking, so do you have the drummer record the entire take with no cymbals and then overdub them lately? I mean, later on in the process, Dan Smith asked the same question. Thanks for sharing your awesome process with you, Joe. Love your work. Can you elaborate more on how you track the cymbals? Are they overdubs? So some questions about that. Are you doing multiple passes of drums?
Yeah, so probably in this case, and often I do it, not always, because sometimes a style of music, maybe a more aggressive rock drum track, might really have a lot of cymbal work, and it might be difficult for the drummer to really pull that off and not hit the cymbals. So it'll be recorded at the same time. But with a lot of modern alternative pop, really the sound of the record is about kick and snare and about the groove, and certainly hip hop is about that. There's no cymbals in hip hop, and I think people are kind of accustomed to hearing albums now, or hearing songs that really don't have a lot of crashes and rides, and they can be kind of distracting at times, quite frankly. But in this case, yes, the drummer is just playing a beat, and any crashes on the downbeat of a section or wherever necessary were overdubbed later. So when I'm out in the studio getting my sound, the drummer has the cymbals up there, and I get my drum sounds, I get my cymbal sounds, etc., etc. And then when it's time to start doing takes, he'll take the cymbals off and we'll record the track, and then go back later and do an overdub pass of crash cymbal hits or ride cymbals or whatever is necessary. But he'll play kick, snare, hi-hat, and toms in the live take with the band.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, with a harder rock artist where it's going to be hard for them to do that performance without hitting their cymbals, is it plausible to maybe give them, those rubberized cymbal pads to play while they're playing the drums, and then put them on those mesh drums while they're playing the cymbals, that kind of thing?
I've been there. I've done it. It's sometimes just very hard for the player. And for me, it's all about the performance and getting a great take. And if somebody can pull that off, then great. But a lot of players are so, their body needs to work a certain way. And if you take that away from them, they're put off and they really can't perform. Years ago, when I worked with the Strokes, we did a number of songs where we did every piece of the drum kit separately.
Wow.
Passive kick drum, a passive snare drum, passive hi-hat, a passive toms, passive cymbals. So, for Fab to do those very mechanical, angular beats where there might be a cymbal in the middle of the beat, he had to actually hit something. So yes, to your point, we'd put a piece of foam on a mic stand or whatever it was and have him hit the foam, and then go
Right.
back later and do the cymbals. And it was always a little scary when you solo the drums later, because you'd hear all these thuds in the background of the cymbal crashes.
And hopefully they get masked enough by the cymbals that are going on over them. But that makes sense. And I guess for that kind of approach to work, the artist has to be really gung-ho and really into production as well. And probably will have to practice a little bit of that way before
Yep.
you go like do a little pre-production session where it's like, hey, you're gonna have a day where you just learn these songs again without the feedback you're used to, right? All right, let's get into some more questions around drums. This is another question around drums from Zam Kenobi, who asks, hey, how do you go about drum tuning? And is there guidance that you give to the drummer to get this kind of drum sound to begin with?
Obviously the tuning depends on the music and what you're after. If it's, an R&B thing, you might be higher and tighter and more kind of note worthy, if you will, with snare drum. If it's an alternative thing, to me, it's always almost more about the dampening of the drums than it is about the tuning of the drums. I'm lucky. I work in LA. There's a lot of great studio drummers out here that really understand tuning drums and knowing how to get tones out of them. There are a lot of great drum techs that the drummers actually use, that those guys will come in, set up the drums, tune them properly, and come back in a couple of days if you need them to readdress it. But I'm not afraid to run out in the studio and sit down at the drum kit and just tune myself. And usually it's just more about what I'm hearing in my head, as opposed to going, oh, the snare drum should be tuned to an E, and sitting there with a tension meter or a note from a guitar and trying to match every lug. I'm not that scientific, and I just kind of go for it. So to me, if a tom has the right kind of note and feel and richness, then I'm good. And usually I find when you tune drums perfectly to the song or the key, they almost disappear in the track too much. So I'm not a big believer in that school of like trying to hit notes on a piano and tune every part of the drum kit to that key of the song or whatever. It just never has worked for me, and it's a little arduous, and again, sometimes that can just put off the drummer. And
Right.
So before you even get started making music, you've spent 2 hours tuning things.
Yeah.
It seems crazy to me.
Yeah. I mean, maybe if you're doing one song and it's like a big part of the song in that day and you tune it, but it's interesting whenever I've been in the room with a drum kit that's actually tuned to the key of the song, and like the kick drum is like at the fundamental note of the song.
Right.
It's just like you said, it almost disappears into the track a little bit more. It's interesting. Like, is this kind of like when you first hear, it's like, wow, that's really interesting. Like it's so resonating with everything, but then it doesn't become this prominent kick drum where drums almost need to sound a little noise-like in order to really stick out in the mix. So I definitely understand.
Very, very well put. Yeah, it's true. I mean, I think you get them kind of ballpark in the tone, the pitch of the song, but I don't think you really get them perfect. They have to stand out a little bit. It's almost like when you use a delay on a vocal, a slap or whatever it might be, when it's perfectly in time, it just doesn't quite feel right. And it
too on the nose or something. It
gets boring, and you just make it perhaps so it's a little lazy or a little early. It can either help put the singer in the pocket of the song more, or if you nudge the delay so it's a little rushed, sometimes it can help add energy to the singer. So,
Yeah.
it's always, to me, it's always getting it in the ballpark, but not perfect.
Well, this is one of the reasons I think producer style mixers like yourself do such a great job of finding the emotional impact of the song is you think about things like pocket that not every more engineering mixer thinks about, where, if you want all of a sudden for the song to like feel like it's coming forward at you, you think about, well, what are the elements that are ahead of the beat? Are those the elements we want to emphasize in this section? Or do we want this thing to sound more lazy and like it's more like molasses? Well, what are the elements that are behind the beat? And do we want to emphasize those? And just hearing you talk about pocket and what's ahead of the beat and what's behind the beat is something that I think a lot more people could bring into their vocabulary when mixing, thinking about what role, because you're never going to have a song, right, where everything's straight down the middle on the beat. There's always things that are slightly ahead, always things that are slightly behind, and choosing which ones to emphasize can make a big emotional change, right?
Guitar players rush. Guitar players are always on top of the beat. So if you want to have the chorus jump out more and have the chorus attack more, so on the downbeat of the chorus, you push the guitars because they're a tiny bit, we're talking milliseconds in front of the band, and it makes it feel like, whoa, here's a chorus, or usually the drummer pushes when he hits his cymbal. So that stuff makes things sound more alive. So yes, it's definitely being attuned to that.
Very cool. I'd love to hear you talk about that. All right. Next little batch of questions here, a little bit more about kind of maybe gain stagey session setup and routing things. So a few questions on that. The first one is from Catchy Max, who asks, do you gain stage as you go? Or I guess we could just ask this more broadly. Is gain staging something you think about in production or mixing? Is that something that's important to you? Or are there any rules or notes you'd want to give around gain staging?
Well, there's two things to take into consideration here. This was cut on an analog console. So I'm always watching analog meters as I record, even though I'm recording to Pro Tools. And one thing I'm very aware of is most analog gear, be it a compressor or EQ, was really meant to be used with +4 levels. And certainly you can push it, and sometimes pushing a piece of gear gives it a whole other personality. But I'm always trying to get things in their sort of sweet spot. So when I'm tracking drums, I'm looking at analog VU meters on a console. I'm looking at how the output of a LA2A or 1176 looks, that I'm not hitting it so hard on the output that I'm actually like saturating the transformer in the compressor and compromising the sound of the actual compressor. So I am aware of that stuff while I track. And then when it comes to mixing, I'm that particular track, as well as most things these days, I'm in my little studio here, and I have a analog summing network, a Burl 32 channel summing network. So everything goes through that. Then it goes out through my stereo bus gear, and then back into another Burl, the B2 Bomber, that goes to Pro Tools via AES. So yes, I'm aware of the gain there. I'm aware of how hard I'm hitting my analog gear on the stereo bus side. I have some VU meters here on the console that show me what's going into my summing network, as well as overload indicators. So yeah, so I do watch that. And there are times where, just like as if you were on mixing on an analog console, where things start to sound a little congested and tight and small and choked, you start to go, oh, maybe I'm pushing the bus too hard. And you got to pull things back. There's certainly with consoles are like sports cars, or at least a good console is, that you really have to learn how to drive them. You have to learn how hard you can drive it, and what that sounds like when you hit the console hard, or what it sounds like when you hit the console cold. For jazz record or a pop record. You want something that's a little sweeter, softer, more open on the top end. So you're a little more cognizant of your levels, and you hit the stereo bus gently to leave all that headroom and all that air. But sometimes you want the console to work for you and really become part of the glue of the mix. And by saturating the console, by pushing into the console, things just all of a sudden start to glue together. So, you really have to learn, like, okay, how far can I push this piece of gear? And at some point, then it starts to sound edgy and buzzy and harsh, or it sounds all squished together and your mix actually is smaller than it should be.
Yeah, that makes sense. And to some degree, some of these analog modeled plugins, I imagine, are going to be somewhat the same way. So it's still,
Absolutely.
yeah, something to
The
look
way the
at.
distortion curves get measured, absolutely. Yep.
Another couple quick questions, generally related. Kyle White says it's interesting that he has to hit record to play the song in this demo. Wonder what kind of setup that is. So he noticed that you have a record track that you're printing your mix to. So every time we're listening to, I guess, probably input monitoring on that record track. So are you going through some analog hardware as well, or do you just have like a multi-bus setup inside where you're printing every pass? Why is that you're recording your mix when you're listening back?
Simply because there is an analog chain on the stereo bus. And I believe in the case of that track, there was a Chandler Curve Bender EQ, a Shadow Hills compressor, and probably also a Cush clariphonic EQ on that mix.
And people, go ahead.
No, it might have been, just a notch or two on the curve bender and notch or two on the clariphonic.
Right. Yeah. People, I think generally probably understand what people are looking for compressors to do on the mix bus, but a lot more people, especially beginning people, are more afraid or hesitant to use EQ on the mix bus. What are you looking for an EQ on the mix bus to do? And what are the benefits to you of using global EQ rather than only doing it on a track by track basis?
It's just sort of finishing things off, trying to get things closer to a kind of mastered sound where there's a sort of continuity to the top end. Sometimes putting a little 16 or 20K overall on the mix tends to open it up and also kind of glue the acoustic guitars and the vocal to the track a little better. Or, maybe you need a little bit more extension on the bottom end of the electronic track, so you're adding a little bit of 50 or 70 or whatever it is to it. It's really kind of just getting your mix to be one notch bigger.
Sure. All right. Let's see if we can get through some more of these questions. We have just a treasure trove of them. I don't know if we're going to get through all of them today, but keep them coming into the questions now. We're still going through questions that came in during the live Q&A. Hopefully we'll get through all of these and get through some of your questions that came in. I'm sorry, we're going through all the questions that came through the live premiere, and hopefully we'll get to a lot of your questions that came in through the live Q&A. So feel free to keep adding them there, and we'll get to as many as we have time for. Next one here, this is probably a short one, but Sarah Galvin was saying, I don't understand why we hear the vocal and the bass reverb. So you're soloing the bass, there's reverb there, and we heard vocal reverb. Obvious answer to that is the vocals are being sent to the reverb pre-fader, but good question there is why? Why send reverb, vocal reverb and pre-fader? Why were we hearing vocals while we were soloing the bass and listening to its reverb?
Okay, I have an answer for you because you're right. You shouldn't really hear that. And it's rare that I put something in pre-fader reverb, especially in the digital world. It doesn't seem to make as much difference to me as it would have on an analog console. Yeah, but in this case, there is a printed reverb. The guys at their home studio, when they make all their demos, they have a AKG BX10 spring reverb.
Yeah, cool.
And they love it. And it's kind of like been the sound of all their demos. So when we did the album here, they brought the reverb to my studio and I used it for mix down. And as that is an analog device and I wanted to capture it in the sessions, I actually printed the reverb. So while I'm showing you that mix, there probably would have been a live track of printed vocal reverb through the spring reverb. So you are correct in that normally you wouldn't hear that.
Right. So
I
this
think
is,
there
I'm
might
going
have
to
been
jump ahead here.
Yep.
I'm going to jump ahead here because on the guitars, one of the questions that people ask when you were soloing the guitars is, what is that spring reverb being used? It sounds amazing, asks Lisa Uzanis. And a couple other people said the same thing. Watch that spring reverb. I love it. During the guitars, are there any spring reverb plugins on there as well? Or is it really all the BX10 on the guitars there?
On the guitars, it might have been a little bit of the BX10. It might have been actually the spring reverb on a Fender Deluxe amp, because we actually did a lot of that. A lot of the spring reverbs that you hear on the guitars are actually amp reverbs. On the bass, there is a pretty prominent reverb on certain songs on the album. I can't remember how much it was really featured on the Ride the Wave cut, but basically the bass player would have given me 3 signals. One that was out of his direct box, one that was a microphone on the Ampeg B15 amp, and then a third one, which was a split from his direct box, which went to a spring reverb. And we used a couple of different things. Sometimes it was a pedal that he had. Other times it was a Sansui old hi-fi spring reverb. Sometimes it was a combination. In fact, I've often taken combinations of spring reverbs and bust them all together, because you end up with this, you know how the springs kind of bounce around and you get these kind of weird little explosions and quirky tones. So sometimes I'll actually use a couple of different spring reverbs and blend them together, like for a cross stick reverb on a snare drum. Spring reverbs sound great because they're just so boingy, and a couple of them together can be a real interesting character.
Yeah, absolutely. There's some beautiful reverbs on here. And you talking about the spring reverbs reminded me of a question of my own, skipping ahead a moment to vocals. You were talking about on the vocal, how you kind of do automation, and you said particularly on the spring reverb on this one. And if I remember correctly, you had automation on the spring reverb where you were bringing up the spring reverb during the verses and bringing it down during the choruses, where I recall you saying. Can you give us a sense about what you'd be looking for in automating a reverb from section to section, and why you might want less of that reverb on a chorus than on a verse? Any insights there?
Yeah, usually in this case, there's space in the verse, between lines to hear the decay of the reverb. And it's also to help give the song a little bit more personality. The band really is steeped in 60s California sound, Beach Boys, Jan and Dean, that kind of thing. So they love those kinds of tones. Most of the guitars were Tellys and Strats, single coil kind of stuff. The drums were old Ludwig drums. So, we tried to go for tones that had a little bit of that retro kind of personality in it. So in the verses, there is space to really hear that reverb and let it be part of the feature of the sound. But the chorus, once it's layered with background vocals and additional guitars, it just tends to get a little messy. So I probably a spring reverb without a lot of pre-delay tends to be a little shorter and more early reflections, if you will, and gets a little messy and busy with the vocal.
Right.
So I probably would have pulled those back to leave room in the chorus for other parts to poke through.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I like what you're saying about the 60s California vibe. This track, if I had to sum it up in one word, it would be bopping. You don't hear a lot of tracks that bop, these days. And this one totally, it just has this rhythmic feel that just immediately just evokes a certain kind of time and place. Very cool. All right. So many questions here. I'm going to try to maybe skip over a couple and come back to some. I'm not going to do them all in order just because there's so many here and I want to make sure to get to some great ones. Jumping into some of the guitar ones, we had a couple questions about the way that you're using that you're working with guitars. First of all, comment from Catchy Max. He says, I love the way reverb is used on some, but not all of the guitars. So the guitars go from sounding distant to sounding near. And he was just really appreciative of hearing the kind of difference in depth and placement front to back of the guitars. A couple of specific questions about this stuff. Here's one from someone named Imari. who says, question about committing sounds when tracking. Do you aim to try to get as close to a finished sound as you can, or do you leave a little wiggle room for later, such as not boosting EQ like crazy, etc.? So when you're doing these sounds, getting these electric guitar sounds, or even adding processing with your outboard as you're recording, are you trying to just go all the way towards where you think it should be finished, or are you reeling yourself in a little bit, saying, hey, I can always do more later, I don't want to mess it up now? And how do you strike that balance?
No, I kind of go for it. Whatever I think is the right choice for the song, I go for it. If it's a ton of reverb, or it's totally dry, or it's heavily compressed or not, I just kind of try to get it on the tracking day. And, a lot of that comes from the fact that I grew up in the analog 24-track world, where really you got your sounds on the tracking date. There was no sort of post-production plugins that were added while you were overdubbing. You really had a tracking stage and a mixing stage. And, records now are sort of made step by step. Your mix is actually really a conclusion of your overdubbing process in a lot of ways. And so I'm never afraid to put the processing on. As you can see, almost all the guitars are just, each guitar part is on one track. And that one track is probably a combination of 2 or 3 microphones, maybe with reverb or delay, whether it came from the player's stomp box or something I added with a piece of outboard gear. It really was a choice that was made. So even all my guitars, if I record them in the main room at Sunset, or a recording, do my guitar recording a lot here in my room, I have a summing box, and I'll take the 57 and the Royer 121 and whatever perhaps I'm using for a room mic, and I'll combine that all to one channel, and that's it. That becomes the guitar sound.
Yeah, that makes sense. And just piggybacking on that, one of our commenters in here writes, I'm sorry, I can't read your name because it's in like kanji characters. Actually, it might be Korean, I'm not sure, but he says, really eye-opening how most of the tracks have just 2 plugins, 3 at most. And I guess a lot of that comes from you taking that approach going in. Another question here, specifically about getting guitar sounds to fit together. Ashwin asks again, I wonder how he gets his guitar sounds to fit together so well frequency-wise, and how to keep them present without being harsh or overemphasizing offending overtones. Before you answer that one, I'll piggyback my own observation onto that, which is some of the EQ things you did here on the guitars. I noticed you did some, low roll-offs, but you also often found like one spot in the mid-range to boost a little bit more than I expected and a little bit narrower than I might have expected, but it really worked. So do you have thoughts about that, about getting them to fit together well with and stay present without being harsh or overemphasizing the wrong spots?
Yeah, a lot of it really comes from that sense of trying to understand the big picture before you even start the record, knowing that I want my guitars to be single coil, thinner, brighter, and I want them to kind of sit up here in the record. But if I have any kind of more power guitars, I want them to be a little thicker and not so visible in the mix, because it would be outside the idiom, in this case, outside the character of the band. So I might want them to be darker sounding and sit underneath things. So yeah, I'm choosing the guitar, I'm choosing the amp, I'm choosing the frequency of EQ while I track it, and kind of thinking in terms of layering things, or even in terms of a painting where, I want my 2 chorus arpeggios to sit high up here, and I'm deliberately having the guitar player play it in a higher register or higher voicing. And I want I want a baritone guitar somewhere between the bass and those high guitars to just fill in a single line. So I'm kind of thinking of it in terms of almost octaves or layers and how things sit. And often with the EQ that you noted in the mid-range, yeah, it's like I'm trying to find that one spot where it just pokes through the mix enough, it gives the character of that sound, it comes to life, and it doesn't interfere with all the others, because sometimes you don't need to hear all that lower mid-range on a guitar, but sometimes you really want to hear it because it becomes the sound of the cabinet, the wood of the guitar, the paper of the speaker. So you want all that thick, chunky lower mid-range in there. So yeah, I'm really thinking of how can I get these to speak? How can I get their individual parts to do what they're supposed to do without eating up the whole album, whole song? You know, years ago, I remember working with Frank Zappa, and we on one particular song, we did it actually quite often, just as an experiment, because he would love to layer tons of guitar stuff. And we did this thing where we deliberately went, okay, this particular guitar here, to make it speak through the track, we're going to give it a 12 dB boost at 3K. And this guitar, we're going to give it a 12 dB boost at 4K. And this other one, we're going to give it a 5K 12 dB boost. And then you're able to, almost like you play notes in a chord, you know, like let things sneak through just in the way that they needed to. So Frank was really brilliant like that. Really, really, really brilliant. Like
that's cool. It's almost like in a way, it sounds very dramatic to do a 12 dB boost, but it's almost like a gentler way of doing a band pass filter, you know, where you would take out everything outside that range. And I think so much of this is so resonant to me because it's one of the things I hear on so many of my favorite records where guitars are handled well. It's a mixer understanding that, okay, this guitar is about bite at 3K. This guitar is about bite at 1K, and they don't need to both be perfectly balanced guitars. We're not trying to listen to them in solo and make them the perfectly balanced guitar sound by itself and then put them together, because that's how you get mush. They're like you're doing, listening to them in context and saying, what's the role that this guitar plays in the mix, and what needs to be emphasized? What's the role that this one plays? And on a certain guitar, it might be about 700 hertz is where part of that tone lives, and it's okay to go forward with that. So it's really,
you know, I'm glad you brought up solo, because it's one thing I never use when I'm mixing.
Right.
It's rare that I solo something when I'm mixing. Certainly when I'm tracking, because I want to make sure things are clean or there's not hum or mud or whatever on there. But when I mix, it's really about the big picture. So most of the time, and I hope I explained it well in the video, that I have the vocals in the track when I'm blending everything else, and I'll take them out for a while, but I'll definitely start with every single element in the track. And then if I find that I'm getting confused or there's too much going on, maybe I'll take the background vocals out or the keyboards out or whatever and sort some things out and then put them back in and make sure that I just didn't take up all the neighborhood that I needed to fit the keyboards in, you know. But I try to leave everything in the track and look at it as a whole, as opposed to pieces.
That makes a lot of sense. And I'm going to go rogue here and ask one of my own questions again. We still have more audience questions I want to see if we can get to. We've had Joe on for about 45 minutes already. Time really flies by. It's a lot of fun to do this with you. So I want to be respectful of your time. But one of the questions here that I have is, you think big picture so much, and you're talking about plotting out, you know, what's the role of each of these guitars in advance. I feel like the only way to do that effectively is to do some pre-production with the artist. So what does that process look like for you? Is pre-production about listening to their demos and taking notes? Is it about doing pre-production recording dates with them before a real date? What does pre-production look like for you in this 21st century with everyone having their own DAWs and all?
You know, usually everybody does a demo of some degree, and it's not mandatory for me. You know, actually my favorite things are when somebody just comes in with an acoustic guitar and sings the tune, because then you can imagine anything, you know. You're not stuck. And often, you know how it goes with demos, doesn't matter if the demo is good or bad, it's what you've been listening to for the last 6 months, so it becomes part of the DNA of the song. And I'm always having to incorporate elements of an artist's demo into the final track, just because, you know, it's in their head. It's been there from the start.
Yeah.
But what I like to do, especially with guitar-oriented bands, is to do some degree of pre-production, which means for me being in a rehearsal room with all the players, playing the tunes down, dissecting the bass and drum parts, the groove, getting the right tempo, the right key, then really diving into guitar parts. And, you know, often you start to realize when you separate the parts that, oh, well, two guys are playing the same part, and it's really, nothing's complementing each other. It's almost like they're imploding because you just got the same thing on top of another guitar part. And all of a sudden, if you say, okay, what if you play a simpler chord, in other words, not a full chord, just two notes? Or what if you move your part up the octave? Or what if you change your strumming pattern from the other guitar part? And all those things that end up making for a fuller, bigger record, because all the parts are a little different and complementing each other, as opposed to everybody just doing the same thing, you know? So for me with a band, I like to spend a week, 10 days, and really kind of make sure all those parts are doing what they should do before I even get into the studio.
Very cool. All right, let's get to some questions from the live Q&A. We'll be coming up on an hour soon, so I want to see if I can get through a couple of your latest questions. Before I do, while I'm reading through some of these, I just want to give you the opportunity, Joe. Once upon a time, I've done more than one thing on, you know, bit depth and sample rate, and I'm on record as being a little bit of a bit depth and sample rate, you know, skeptic, where I'm one of those guys who's like, it's fine, 44.1 is enough, and you know, I'm not super swayed for myself to use higher bit depth and sample rates. But I noticed that you checked out one of my videos on this and you disagreed, and you do a lot of stuff at higher bit depths and sample rates. So I just want to give you a platform. I'm not going to argue with you or try to persuade you or contradict you. I just want to give you a platform to make your case for why it's something that maybe people should look into.
I don't, you know, it's just simply, it sounds better to me. It seems easier on my body, and practically speaking, I think there's more room left in the sound. I think I hear the space between instruments more at higher bit depths. So I've pretty much, I'll tell you, in I think 1999 or 2000, I did an album with really great jazz trumpet player Chris Bodie, and we were gonna do it analog, because Chris really wanted to do it analog, but the logistics of the record were kind of crazy, and it would have been difficult for us to do it all analog. And Chris finally said, okay, I'll give in and I'll do it Pro Tools if you guys promise that we do it at 2496, because anything below that just doesn't feel right to me. And we did the record at 2496, and honestly, I've never done anything at a lower sampling rate since then, because it was so eye-opening to me. Chris was right. There's less hash in the top end. There's more air. Things seem to sound a little bit more open, more natural, and they don't fight each other as much. So ever since that moment, I've never looked back, and I've always, and you know, since Pro Tools came out with 32-bit float within the DAW, I've been doing everything 3296. And I have done a number of things at 192, and they do sound great. It gets a little cumbersome in terms of storage, and not all plugins will work at that sampling rate. So I've opted to not do that. Sometimes when I'm doing something that might just be piano and vocal, or acoustic guitar and vocal, I'll do it at 192. But most of the time, 3296 seems to be the way to go for me.
Fair enough. And I can definitely relate to having those kinds of experiences that really, change the way you approach things for a long, long time after. So I definitely appreciate where you're coming from. A couple cool comments here. Spiky Pup writes in, I've been using the IK plugin of Joe's for quite some time, and it's one of my favorite go-to plugins, especially for gritty vocals. So
All right.
that's a cool endorsement of the plugin. Definitely check it out. I have some links here in the show notes in the description and in the comments where you can find IK Multimedia and Joe's plugin specifically. So definitely try it out. I imagine there's a free trial on that. Play around with it. In the last couple minutes we have here, we're almost up on an hour. So just in the last few minutes here, I'm going to see if I can get a last couple ones in. Landeros Productions asks here in the live Q&A, how do you approach attack and release for different compressors? And I'll add on to that. That's interesting. There's no actual attack and release controls that I noticed, I think, on your plugin. So it's almost like each one has its preset attack and release. So how do you think about attack and release when you're using compressors?
I in general tend to go for slower attacks and faster releases because they're to my ear more natural sounding. Dynamics are retained a little more, but there's reasons that you do the opposite. And in the case of the plugin, for instance, the Fairchild plugin is kind of set at a faster attack and a slower release, and it's deliberate because to me that holds the sound more. And what I mentioned before, where what I want out of that particular compressor is a sense of size and thickness, and having the sound stay there all the time, having it constant. So basically I'm slowing down the release so every note stays up in your face, and it's not decaying as quickly as in the plugin that the 1176 might be, because it's set at a faster release. So those release times on those three compressors in the plugin were deliberate choices. Of course you're always using it a little different, but they're ballparked to what I might do.
All right, great. We just had Bernardo Reyes write in with a super chat. He did a $10 super chat here. So we're going to ask his question. Bernardo Reyes has actually been on, I think, almost all of the MixCon live streams to date so far. And he's asked every single producer a very important question. Now, first, he has a comment, which is one of my favorite mixes of all time is Life is Simple in the Moonlight by The Strokes. Do you have any stories about that track or process? And then his secondary question, this is the important question he asks every single producer, is what is your favorite sandwich?
Okay. Well, I'm not eating bread these days, so that's a tough anscer. But
it would have to be a lettuce wrap of some kind, possibly.
Yeah, probably that. But it would. I'm vegetarian, so it would be a vegetable sandwich of some sort with perhaps some pesto or olive oil or whatever. Maybe maybe a little buffalo mozzarella. Who knows? But in terms of the Strokes track, that
Life is Simple in the Moonlight, he said.
Yeah, so that I didn't mix, so I can't specifically tell you about the mix, but the tracking was all done at Avatar Studios, which is one of the greatest studios in the world, and great old Neve console, and the guys in that band are such great players and have such great tones, and it always starts on the other side of the glass. If you have a great player with great tone in his fingers and a great guitar and a great guitar amplifier, it's really easy. It's when it's not happening on the musician end that it's tough. Then you have to kind of manufacture things, and the guys, all those guys in that band, they're just great, and they really understand their roles, and it's very interesting how the parts fit in all their tunes, because quite often their roles in the band are not typically what you would think a guitar player is doing or bass player is doing. They're kind of playing in different registers than you might expect, but they just have a very unique way of putting it all together.
Beautiful.
They're really, really brilliant guys. It was really, really an honor to work with them.
I saw those guys live once. It was a tremendous show. It was actually, I was a fan of the band, the Moldy Peaches. Do you remember the Moldy
yeah,
Peaches?
Of course. Yeah.
And I actually went to see the Moldy Peaches, and they were opening up for this band called the Strokes. And I actually hadn't heard of this band called the Strokes because I'm a dork. And I was like, oh, fine, I guess I'll stay for these headliners too. And I saw them. I was like, whoa. Now I get why people like these guys. They did it tremendously well. So we're coming up on an hour here where we should be letting Joe get back to the rest of his busy day.
They're knocking on my door. They're telling me I got to get back to work.
All right. So here is our last and final question for you. If you can give us the 60-second lightning round answer to it, and then Joe is gone. We'll have to say bye, Joe, and thank you so much for your time here today. I think this is a good one to end it on. It is Luca Gembik who asks, do you have any advice for production students, aspiring mixers or engineers about starting out in the industry and getting jobs in it?
Wow. I think you just simply take every opportunity, any opportunity. I think you can't be fussy. I think you can't refuse to work on something if it's not a style of music you like, or even a style of music that you can't relate to, because I think you can learn everything. Different styles of music have different priorities, different sets of values, and I think you really can learn a lot of things by studying them. And more so, I think when you're first starting out, it's really about meeting people and networking. And the more you can take advantage of any situation, you just never, ever know where it leads to. You work on something for a band or an artist, and maybe the album flops or it never even gets released, but one guy in the band loved working with you and he passes it on to somebody else that is a friend of theirs and says, I loved working with this guy, you should try to work with him. So really there's the opportunity in every opportunity.
Yeah, that's great. There's opportunities bundled within opportunities.
Yes.
I think this has been a great talk, Joe. Bernardo Reyes says, thanks for everything, Joe. You've mixed most of my favorite bands. Huge fan. We have so many different people saying kind words in here and so many more questions we could get to, but I think a good hour of Joe's time is just amazing luxury to have. So thank you again, Joe, for being here.
It was great. Always good to see you, man. Nice to take part in these.
Right back at you. A couple quick final notes. Big shout out and thanks to the band Cayucas. I just put in a link there in the show notes. A couple more of you were asking where the band is, where you can hear about them, where you can listen to this track. A lot of people liked it. So check out that link I just put into the comments. Big thanks also to IK Multimedia. Check out anything they make over at ikmultimedia.com. They make great plugins. They were some of the earliest in the industry making good sounding software emulations, and they've been doing it all the way up through today. Their stuff keeps getting better, and they have Joe's own vocal strip, which you can use on vocals and you can use on everything apparently. So definitely check it out. You'd be doing yourself a disservice not to go and just try to get a free trial of it right after this. So go over to ikmultimedia.com for that. Last quick note, we have a mixcon mega giveaway going where we are giving away more than $10,000 worth of free gear. So look for that in the description as well. You got multiple chances to win. So good luck to you. Thanks to IK Multimedia for sponsoring this. Thanks to the band Cayucas for allowing us to go under the hood of their track. And thank you, most importantly, to the great Joe Chiccarelli for joining us today. It's just been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Absolutely.
All right.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for the questions.
Thank you guys for hanging. Yep. Thank you guys for hanging out with us. See you next time.
Bye-bye.
All right. And we are